Hello, and welcome to our fourth lesson from the book of Judges. Today we'll be looking at Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 24. And this is the story of Deborah and Barak. But before we get started, let me open us with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity we have to get together today. Although we are not together physically, we are together emotionally and spiritually in you. And in all things, we thank you for the opportunity to learn from your word. Help us to gather wisdom and insight into your word. Help us so that it helps us struggle with our day, and that we come through the other side of our day in joy and happiness. And in all things, we thank you for your Son, who sacrificed himself for us. We thank you for the grace that you give to all of us. And we thank you for the love that you also impart to us. And in all things, we thank you and we praise you and we praise your name. Amen. Our reading today begins with Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. So as we begin our lesson today, we discover again there's that opening phrase. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now I want you to note here that this time they throw in the word again, because this is again a repeating pattern, and this is our fourth judge, and our opening statement will be, as we move through this, that again that the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And it will be again, and then maybe later it will be they continued. But what's basically the idea is that again they failed to do what is right in God's eyes. And so Yahweh Adonai sells them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, and his home base was in Hazor. And his commander was named Sisera, and he lived in a different town of Harosheth Hagoim. But he oppressed them, and he oppressed them cruelly, it says, for 20 years. And so they again, at the end of this 20 years, they start crying out to God. They start crying out to Yahweh for help. And this army is powerful. They have 900 chariots with iron on them, whether the wheels are iron, or whether there's iron plate, or whether there's iron shielding on it. It's not very clear, but he had chariots that had iron with them. And so that made them very powerful in that day. This is the very beginning of the Iron Age, the very end of the Bronze Age. And so this is right at that transition point between bronze and iron. And the Philistines and some of the Canaanites had access to iron. We'll learn later that the Philistines actually during David's time, not as king, but as David's time during Saul's period and just prior to Saul's period, that the Philistines really controlled most of the iron that moved into the region. And so the Philistines were very careful in making sure that other entities in the region, other peoples in the region, did not receive or learn how to do iron. And that again is a much later story. So the Israelites have been oppressed for 20 years, and they finally get around to the point where they again remember that God is out there, that their God is out there, that Adonai is there, and they start praying to Adonai to release them from this bondage. Picking up now with verse 4. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lepidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Go take position at Mount Tabor. Bring 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. So, as the story progresses here in verse 4, we discover, or we learn of Deborah, a prophetess and the wife of Lapidoth. Now, what we need to recognize too is that first off, it wants to recognize her first is that she's female, that she's a woman, and that she is a prophet, and we have the word prophetess, and she is the wife of Lapidoth. So she's given three roles here. She's a judge, she's a prophet, and she's a wife. Well, actually, three roles. She's a woman, she's a prophet, and she's a wife, and a final attribution to her is she's also a judge. Now, she is the judge that we typically type of judge we think about later, as in later stories, is that she's the kind of judge who would sit under the tree and make judgment for the people. The people would come to her with their issues, with their problems, with their difficulties, with their neighbor or with something else, and they would come to her and she would make judgment. And so this is a very unusual role in this society, in this culture, in that culture there. This is a very unusual role for a woman. But here she sits, called up by God to be a prophet, to be a judge, to actually make judgment on the people. We also discover that she makes her judgment by sitting under the palms, which is the palm of Deborah, which in reality is kind of an oasis here where there are lots of palm trees in the area. And she sits under the cool of these palm trees to make judgment. And these two, and this place where she's staying, this reservoir, this oasis where she is between Ramah and Bethel. So it's between those two, and it is in the tribal territories of Ephraim. What we need to recognize here is, again, as we're moving with the story, as we're moving into the tribes of her story, here we are. At this time, we're again back in, she is from the hill country of Ephraim, so she is an Ephraimite, she sends for Barak, and he is the son of Abinoam, and he's from Naphtali. So, what we have is, what we're going to see here is we're going to get kind of a joint operation between Ephraim, Naphtali, and as we move forward, also Zebulun is brought into the fray. So she sits in judgment over Israel, over the people. And again, whenever we speak of Israel, we're talking about the northern tribes. Judah is outside of that, what is considered Israel, because it is Judah, and it's slightly different. And so she is judging from the northern tribes, and we recognize here, because the three names are mentioned, that it's Ephraim, Naphtali, and Zebulun is where she is judging, is where she does. And so she summons, maybe God spoke to her, and I would imagine so, that Barak has already been kind of put into the position of a leader in that tribe, in the tribe of Naphtali, but he is a reluctant leader in some ways, as we'll see. And so she is, and I would suspect that God spoke to her and told her that here's what I want you to do. I want you to call up this fellow Barak, and I want you to set him up to be the commander of the forces that are now going to go. And so she calls Barak up, and he comes to her. Now again, we need to note that she sent and summoned Barak, and he arrives in her presence. So again, although he seems to be the war chief, she seems to have even more, she has some more authority over him than would be normal for the circumstance, which is just, again, a very unusual story that we have here. So she sends for Barak and tells him very clearly that Adonai, the God of Israel, that Adonai Elohim, the God of Israel, commands you. So again, here she is speaking for God, and she tells him that God commands you to do this. He commands you to go and take position at Mount Tabor and bring 10,000 troops, or bring 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. And God tells him further that once you've done that, I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, and he will meet you at the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Here's what God's promise is, that I will set this whole stage up for you. You show up on Mount Tabor and get all your troops up there on the top of Mount Tabor. And I will call Sisera, and he will show up with his army and all of his chariots, and they will be at the Wadi at Kishon. Now, what we need to recognize is that this is actually to Israelite benefit that it occurs this way, because the Wadi at Kishon would have been kind of a muddy flat. It would have been a very damp soil, very wet soil. And these chariots would not have they just wouldn't have the mobility or the ability to fight as well as if they were in desert terrain or in dry ground. And so here, this is going to be wet ground, and it would be especially if these chariots had iron, that would make them a little extra heavy, and so they would have less mobility here in this Wadi of Kishon. And God tells them that once they've arrived there, I will deliver them into your hand. Now that's pretty definite. I mean, that's not like, okay, and then maybe if you do this or you do that or you do this other thing, that I'll make this all happen. No, it's pretty clear. He is to take his troops up onto the top of this little hill, Mount Tabor, and Sisera's troops will be brought in, and pretty much God will just hand this thing over to Barak. But as we discover, Barak does not have the same faith in God that Deborah has. And he says to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Basically, what he's saying is that unless the prophet of God goes with me, I will not go. That unless God's voice goes with me, I will not go. Now, God has already promised to Barak that the battle is at hand. All he has to do is show up. All he has to do is show up, and God will make this all happen. But Barak has his fears. And so he lays those fears on Deborah and says, unless you go with me, I'm not going to go. So we see that Barak does not have that same faith that Deborah has. So she says to him, I will surely go with you. But then she lays the caveat, because the road which you are going will not lead to your glory, because of your fear, that although the victory is going to happen, you're not going to get credit for it. Instead, that credit will go to the hand of a woman, because that's who will lead you to glory, and that's who it'll be a woman who actually ends this whole conflict. So Deborah gets up and she goes with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summons the tribe of Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. With 10,000 warriors, they go up behind him, and so he's in the lead. And Deborah went up with him. So we see a difference here in how this is all handled out. Is the troops follow behind with Barak in the lead, but he is not so much in the lead as Deborah is, who is right beside him. It says here, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. And that indicates that she was right by his side. So God's voice was right by his side, and yet he still had fear in him. Picking up now with verse 11. Now, Heber the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and it had camped as far away as Elon Bazananim, which is near Kadesh. Okay, so we meet another character in this story, and that's Heber. Now, Heber is a Kenite, and he separated from the other Kenites. Now, the Kenites were that tribe of people that joined the Israelites as they left Egypt, and they were wandering as they were moving through. They came near where Moses' father-in-law lived, and Jethro, that's what his name was. And again, he has other names. He also is known by Ruel. But Jethro comes and meets him. Meets Moses, and then kind of lays out some instruction for him, helps him organize the troops or organize the camps, kind of sets up a hierarchy and helps him with all of that. And then he goes back and then he goes back to his home. But part of that tribe, part of the Kenites, part of Jethro's tribe, joins with Moses and the rest of the Israelites as they wander through. And eventually they all end up in the Promised Land. What we're led to understand here is that the word separated in this is that he actually became different than the rest of the Kenites. And what happens is that he made a treaty with the king of with King Jabin of Hazor. Heber had made a treaty with him and had called for peace and was living in peace with King Jabin with King Jabin. He had made a treaty with him. Well, this broke with the rest of the Kenites. Because they're all part of Israel, they're all part of that. But Heber here, who has separated himself from the rest of his tribe, the rest of his people, and moved to a faraway place, to Elon Bezananim, which is near Kadesh. And so that's why he made a treaty with him, because it was near Kadesh, which is where all of this was taking place. This is where this was the important place. And so Heber was really on the other side. Heber, the man, the husband, the leader of this particular tribal group, was on the other side. He was with the Canaanites. Picking up now with verse 12 through verse 16. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Hirosheth Hagoim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. So, going back to verse 12. So Sisera finds out or hears that Barak has moved up and has gone with his troops up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera then, seeing that happen, he calls out his chariots, 900 of his chariots of iron, and all the troops that go with them. And they all take off and they head from Harosheth Hagoim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah told Barak. Now, so the army Sisera, hearing that Barak is moving all of his troops up to Mount Tabor, he gets his army together with all of his chariots, and they head out also toward the Wadi. And so, the battle is getting prepared. All the troops are in place, are getting ready to be in place. And so Deborah sees this, and she tells Barak that it's time. Get up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. What he tells him is get up, because Adonai has done this, and you're going to win. All you have to do is show up. All you have to do is show up. So Barak goes down. He goes down from Mount Tabor. Again, all of his troops have assembled on top of Mount Tabor. And as the battle begins, he moves down, and his troops follow right behind him. And so he goes down with his 10,000 warriors right behind him. And the troops in the chariot and the troops that are on the ground there in Sisera's army, they see what's going on, and they panic because of the 10,000 coming down. Now, I would imagine, remember, I already told you that they were going to have difficulty with all of these chariots because of the ground that they were on. This Wadi was soft soil, and so these heavy chariots would not be able to maneuver well. And so the troops, realizing that the charioteers and those that are in the chariots and those that are beside the chariots realize that that's really the truth of what's going to happen, and they're not going to be able to control the battle this way. And so they panic, and they start, and they get down from their chariots, and the troopers start running, and they start running away. And even Sisera sees the danger, and he sees, and he throws into fear, and he gets down from his chariot, and he starts fleeing away on foot. Barak pursues the chariots and the army to this place called Harosheth Hagoyim, and all of Sisera's army falls by the sword, with no one left. So they lose the battle. But we know now that Sisera is on foot. So now picking up with verse 17, and we'll read through verse 22. This is another longer section. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then, as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead, with the tent peg through his temple. So, Sisera, as we knew, fled away on foot, and he comes into the little encampment of Heber, and he comes to the tent where Jael, who's Heber's wife, is, and we discover that here in this passage we discover that there is a peace treaty between Hazor and the Kenite tribe here. That Heber and the Kenite and his Kenites and King Jabin of Hazor had made a peace treaty with each other. And Sisera knew of this and thought thought he was coming to a safe place. And so Jael comes out of the tent, seeing out to meet Sisera, and she tells him to come on into the tent. "I will provide you with a safe place." And so he comes into the tent, and she lies, and she has him. He's tired. He's really weary, and all he wants is a drink of water. And so she has him lie down, and she covers him with a blanket or with a rug. and he asks her for a little drink of water. But what does she give him? She doesn't give him water, which would be very refreshing. Instead, she gives him some milk. Now, you all know what happens when you get some warm milk, and this would be warm milk in that day. That just makes you tired. You know, a lot of us drink warm milk before we go to bed. I don't, but other people do. And so she hands him a little glass or a little cup of warm milk, and he drinks that down, and of course that makes him just even more tired. And she covers him up. He says to her, stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, is anyone here, say no. So what he does is he says, please guard the entrance, guard the tent here while I sleep, and if anybody comes by, just tell them no, I'm not here. Just lie about this. But Jael has a different plan. Now it could be, it doesn't tell us this, but Jael could actually be an Israelite. She could be. We don't know. But we do know that she does not agree necessarily with what her husband has done. Where he has made peace treaty with Jabin, with King Jabin, maybe Jael just did not agree with that. We don't know. It doesn't really tell us, but she definitely made definitive action here. She didn't hang out and think about it. She didn't decide, oh, what should I do? She just did it. So while he's lying there, sleeping, falling under the doze of the warm milk and the warmth and the comfort in the tent, and believing he's safe, he falls asleep. And she grabs a tent peg. Now, what we need to understand is this is not like those little tent pegs that we use here. You know, if I set up a tent nowadays in the modern world, we have a little tent peg. It's no more than 6-8 inches long, and you drive that into the little thing. And this isn't how that is. These are people who travel the deserts. These are people who set up tents to live in. The stakes, the tent stakes, would be anywhere from 3 to 8 feet long, depending on whether this is a desert tent or a hard ground tent. The Bedouin people, which is what the Kenites are. The Kenites are a Bedouin people, and so they travel a lot. They move around a lot. They're not a settled thing. Now, it seems like Heber has settled into this place, but he would still have a lot of the tradition and a lot of the tools and equipment that they had used when they were traveling, when they were Bedouin movement all the time. And the tent stake would be, you know, it'd be a pretty big thing. It'd be 4 or 5 feet long, and maybe even longer, depending again on whether this is a desert tent or a dry ground tent or a regular ground tent. I don't know how you describe it. So this tent peg would have been pretty long. It would have been a pretty good piece of metal. And so what happens is she sticks it up against the temple of his head, and with her left hand she's holding the stake, and with her right hand she picks up the hammer, and she drives that stake down in through his temple and into the ground. And so she actually stakes his head to the ground, which again, it's kind of gross, but that's the way the story runs for us. And so she stakes him down to the ground while he's asleep, while he's lying fast asleep from all the weariness of his day. And of course he dies. Well, Barak is right behind him in pursuit, not very far behind. There has been enough time for her to kill the man, but Barak is not that far behind in pursuit. And after the deed is done, she goes out and she meets Barak as he's coming through, and she calls him over and says, "Come, I will show you the man whom you're seeking. I'll show you where this fellow is that you're looking for." So she goes into her tent with Barak, and there is Sisera lying dead with a tent peg through his head. Chapter 4, verse 23. So on that day God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until he was destroyed. So in our final verse of this chapter, We see that that the battle on that day was the deciding factor in who was in greater control of the region. And Israel, again, here with God's help, pushed harder and harder on King Jabin until eventually he was destroyed and he was thrown out of the territory. And so this is our fourth chapter of Judges, and we see that Deborah, the only female judge in all of our story, and yet the first female in our story, and she is a very powerful character in the story as we moved through this. Barak is, although he's the war chief, he does not receive any of the recognition for winning the war. That all goes to Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. And so that's kind of also, that's where women in this particular story play a very predominant role, a very strong role. And I hear the voice of women in this story. And so, which makes this story much more unbelievable, or much more believable to me as being a story based in more accurate truth, or in a truth, or in real history. And chapter 5, which is the song of Deborah and Barak, which we will look at next week, really does indicate this. As we move forward in the story, and as next week as we see the song of Deborah, we realize then, or we should realize then, whenever there's a song involved with the story, we have this with Miriam. Way back in the book of Exodus, Miriam's song, after they go through the Sea of Reeds, after they cross through on dry land out of Egypt and into the desert, we have the song of Miriam right there at that transition point between where they are in bondage and moving into freedom, and then where they have found freedom on the other side. This is where Miriam's song picks up. And so whenever we have a song like that, Miriam's song is considered one of the oldest songs or oldest writings in our Hebrew text. And this song of Deborah is also considered a very ancient story, very ancient song. What we need to realize, and again, this is true even in our day today, how many of us remember the words to Mary Had a Little Lamb, or Peter Piper, or many of the other fairy tales, folk tales, and songs, nursery rhymes that we remember even today? I'm 62 years old, and I can remember the nursery rhymes I learned as a child. And these are also the same nursery rhymes that I sang to my children, or my wife sang to our children as we raised them. And so songs like this, like the song of Deborah, like the song of Miriam, like the song of Hannah, like the song of Mary, each one of these represent, I think, and I truly believe this, an older story that was passed on from mother to daughter, or from father to son, from group to group, from generation to generation. These stories were passed on. And sometimes songs are easier to remember, and that's why a lot of these ancient stories, if there is a song attached, I think it is much more likely to be an ancient story that has moved forward through time. And I agree that in a lot of cases these stories have been altered as times change, as music changes, as cultural norms change. Sometimes these stories shifted or moved. Maybe a new song or a new version of the lyrics of the music was put in place, and the old words didn't quite match up with the new hymn, and so the words are changed. We see that also in our modern music. We see things like this, or where one tune is attached to another song, or one song is attached to a different tune. The song changes. And so I think that the song of Deborah has probably been edited over the years, but I also recognize that it's probably one of our oldest writings, and it also reflects a truth, a historical truth. I believe that, and it's when we have these poems, these songs like this, that is even more evident to me that this story is old and was remembered through song. And then maybe even later that song was turned back into what we read today. And so the song next week may have been backtracked into, let's tell the story without the music. And so the story is told. Well, that is my lesson for today. Next week we're going to do chapter 5, the song of Deborah and Barak. I hope you enjoy that. It will be very enjoyable to me because this is a piece of a historical literature that is different, because it is in the form of a song or the form of poetry. And so I really look forward to next week. Please read ahead if you can, or if you desire to chapter 5 of Judges. And next week we will discuss the song of Deborah and Barak. And so I give you peace, I give you joy. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord.